No protests. No headlines. Just silence. And then, absence. In the spring of 2025, over 50,000 American farmers disappeared from the land. They didn't sell out for profit. They didn't retire by choice. They just walked away, one by one. Families packed their tools, shut the barn doors, and vanished from the fields their parents died working on. No one declared a crisis, but drive through the Midwest and you'll feel it. Tractors rusting in place, grain silos full. Not from abundance, but from abandonment. This wasn't a protest. It was a quiet surrender. Not to weather, not to debt, but to a system that promised to protect them and watched them disappear. And while the cameras pointed elsewhere, something irreversible was already happening, right under our feet. But here's what really happened. Before the crops failed, the people disappeared. In early 2025, unannounced ICE raids stormed into farming communities across the U.S., from California's Central Valley to the edge of western Kansas. They didn't target criminals. They targeted labor, the quiet, invisible backbone of American agriculture, the seasonal hands who rose before dawn, picked in 100-degree heat, and sent food to every shelf in the country. In Nebraska, one farm lost 80% of its workforce in just 4 days. In Texas, entire crews vanished, not because they quit, but because they were taken. No plan, no replacement, just gone. And the fields? They stood waiting, but no one came. One farmer in Dodge City told Reuters, "I watched strawberries rot on the vine. My wife cried, not for the money, but for the waste." This wasn't just a labor shortage, it was an amputation, sudden, precise, and devastating. Because this collapse didn't begin with weather, or prices, or yield. It began with a decision made far from the soil that tore the hands from the harvest. And what happened next wasn't a solution. It was a seizure. When the family farms fell, someone was already waiting. It wasn't neighbors. It wasn't other farmers. It was Wall Street. Private equity firms, agribusiness giants, and land-hungry investors swept in, not to save the land, but to seize it. In Iowa, one co-op saw nearly half its neighboring farms sold in under 8 months. Not to locals, but to out-of-state buyers with no roots in the soil. They didn't bring tradition. They brought automation, self-driving tractors, AI-run irrigation, remote monitoring systems. Fields that once echoed with voices now hummed with machines. And behind the screens, a spreadsheet in Manhattan, a quarterly report in Dubai. This wasn't rescue, it was acquisition. Tractors kept moving, yes, but the hands that once gripped the wheel were gone. And with them, the knowledge, the pride, the memory of generations. Local grain silos turned into logistics hubs. Barns became leasing offices. Farming didn't stop, but farming as we knew it was quietly replaced. And while the fields looked full from the highway, the people who made them whole were missing. This wasn't survival. This was surrender, disguised as efficiency. But what happened next caught everyone off guard. While U.S. fields sat still, Canadian farms bloomed. In early 2025, Canada doubled down on its agriculture policy, not with speeches, with support. Low-interest loans, transport subsidies, mental health programs for farmers, and most importantly, stability. In Saskatchewan, provincial cooperatives partnered with young farmers, offering them equity in exchange for long-term stewardship. The result? Canadian wheat exports to the EU doubled within 9 months, edging out U.S. grain, not because it was cheaper, but because it was consistent. One European buyer told Bloomberg, "Canada delivers on time, on quality, and without drama." While American farmers faced seizures, ICE raids, and forced auctions, Canadian farmers were hiring. And the world noticed. South Korea shifted its contracts north. France rewrote its grain quota to include a Canadian floor. Even Mexico, long tied to U.S. corn, began diversifying supply. This wasn't luck. This was planning and policy playing out on the global stage. While America argued over who to blame, Canada planted. And that's what made the difference. But what came next was even harder to swallow. The grain was ready. The trucks weren't coming. In Nebraska, massive silos stood brimming with wheat, untouched. Not because the quality was poor, but because there was no buyer left on the other end. By late spring 2025, European importers had quietly canceled contracts, rerouting to Canada and Eastern Europe. South Korea, once a top destination for U.S. wheat, began sourcing from Australia instead. At a grain terminal in Salina, Kansas, export operations dropped by 53%. One manager told Reuters, "We didn't miss a harvest. We missed the handoff." This wasn't a weather disaster. It was a logistics collapse, built on months of missed signals and broken trust. For global buyers, America had become a question mark. Would the product arrive on time? Would the labor even be there to load it? Would the next shipment be caught in another tariff standoff or policy flip? In a market where reliability means everything, even silence can sound like a warning. And so, the contracts left. Not with headlines, just gone. Farmers weren't watching a price drop. They were watching a relationship evaporate. And with every deal that slipped away, the damage moved from silos to souls. But the deepest wound, the one no one wanted to admit, was still coming. In some places, the barns are still standing, but inside, it's quiet. Not from rest, from retreat. By mid-2025, the Minnesota Farm and Rural Helpline reported a threefold surge in crisis calls. Most came from men over 45, many who hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Not about crops, about collapse. A Wisconsin farmer said in a support circle, "It wasn't just my field that dried up, it was everything I thought I was." This wasn't just a supply chain issue, it was a spiritual one. For generations, rural identity wasn't a slogan. It was sweat, soil, sacrifice. Now, many say they feel like relics in their own towns. The last flicker of a way of life fading. But not everyone disappeared. Across Iowa and the Dakotas, a quiet network of farming co-ops began doing something no federal program did. Listen, not with paperwork, with presence. They pooled fuel, shared machinery, hosted meals, gave neighbors a reason to come down the road again. They weren't fixing the system. They were keeping each other from disappearing inside it. Because what cracked in 2025 wasn't just the market. It was meaning. And that fracture, not the price of grain, is what still echoes in the fields. There was no announcement, no final broadcast, just the slow unspooling of something sacred. One by one, the farms went quiet. Not from drought, not from war, but from a silence much harder to name, indifference. The fields didn't go fallow all at once. They were replaced by machines that didn't remember, by buyers who didn't belong, by policies that didn't ask. What we lost wasn't just wheat or corn or cattle. We lost continuity, the invisible thread between generations, the stories told on front porches, the calloused hands that fed strangers without thanks. And it wasn't because farmers gave up. It's because the country did. Because we stopped seeing them as essential until it was too late. Now, with the world hungrier and hotter than ever, we have to ask ourselves, can a nation survive if it forgets how to feed itself? Not just with food, but with memory, with meaning, with people who still care what the land sounds like when the wind shifts, That's not a question for policy. That's a question for all of us.